September 17th, 1944, 7:30 in the morning. British Airborne Headquarters, near Eindhoven. The maps were already laid out. Aerial photographs overlapped, weighted at the corners. Routes were marked in grease pencil. Bridges were circled in red. The staff officers had been waiting. They knew why they had been summoned. Bernard Montgomery entered without ceremony and took his place at the head of the table. He did not review the room. He did not ask for further reports. The discussion was already over in his mind. He had spent the previous days securing what mattered: Eisenhower's approval, priority for supplies, priority for aircraft, priority for attention. This meeting was not about debate. It was about commitment. Montgomery spoke first and decisively. Operation Market Garden would proceed. Immediately, 3 airborne divisions would be dropped deep behind German lines to seize the bridges across the Netherlands. British armor would drive north along a single highway, linking the airborne forces one by one, crossing the Rhine at Arnhem, and opening the route into Germany itself. The timetable was fixed. The resources were allocated. The objective was explicit. The war, he said, could be finished before winter. An intelligence briefing followed, because protocol required it. Major Brian Urquhart stood and presented his assessment. Reconnaissance photographs from RAF overflights. Intercepted communications. Reports from the Dutch resistance. The evidence was not ambiguous. German armored formations were refitting near Arnhem. Elements of 2 SS Panzer divisions were present in strength, with tanks, artillery, and experienced crews. These were not remnants. They were organized, mobile, and positioned directly astride the final bridge. The room tightened. Several officers understood the implication immediately. Lightly armed airborne troops, landing miles from relief, would face armor within hours. The entire operation depended on speed and assumption. Delay anywhere would cascade everywhere. Montgomery listened without interruption. When Urquhart finished, Montgomery responded briefly. The Germans, he said, were beaten. What remained were scattered elements, incapable of coordinated resistance. Boldness now would save lives later. Hesitation would only prolong the war. The intelligence assessment was noted and dismissed. No formal objection was raised after that. Browning did not press the issue. The staff had learned when resistance was unwelcome. Montgomery had already aligned political support in London and strategic backing at Supreme Headquarters. This operation was British-led, British-commanded, and politically necessary. Changing course now would signal doubt, and doubt was unacceptable. Montgomery issued the final orders. 35,000 airborne troops. Over 1,500 transport aircraft. Thousands of gliders. The launch date confirmed. The axis of advance fixed. The decision was locked. The meeting ended as it had begun. Quietly. Efficiently. No dissent recorded. The decision had been made. The gamble was total. At the moment Montgomery committed to the operation, the military opportunity in front of the Allied forces was not imaginary. It was specific, measurable, and dependent on timing rather than strength. By mid-September 1944, the German army in the West was no longer a coherent defensive system. It was a damaged force in retreat, attempting to reassemble under pressure it could barely absorb. Allied armies had broken out of Normandy and crossed France at a speed that had stunned both sides. German formations were fragmented. Supply lines were dislocated. Command structures were strained. In purely operational terms, the Allies possessed overwhelming advantages in manpower, air supremacy, logistics, and mobility. No German field army in the West could match Allied strength head-to-head. The central opportunity lay in momentum. German forces were retreating faster than they could reorganize. If that momentum could be converted into a deep operational penetration, the Germans would be forced to react rather than plan. Market Garden was designed to do exactly that. It sought to bypass prepared defenses entirely, leap over rivers and obstacles, and land forces directly on the decisive terrain before the enemy could respond. The concept was straightforward in military logic. Airborne troops would seize bridges intact, preventing demolition and removing the need for costly river crossings under fire. Ground forces would advance along a single axis, minimizing dispersion and concentrating combat power. The operation avoided prolonged engagements. It aimed at paralysis, not destruction. In theory, the narrow corridor through the Netherlands offered speed. Roads were paved. Terrain was flat. Rivers ran east-west, making bridges decisive choke points. If those bridges were held, armored columns could move rapidly north without stopping to engineer crossings. The reliance on one road was a vulnerability, but it was also a simplification. All effort would be focused forward. Air supremacy underwrote the plan. Allied aircraft dominated the skies. German fighter resistance was minimal. Transport aircraft could operate in daylight. Close air support could be summoned at will. From a doctrinal standpoint, this was the ideal environment for a large airborne operation. The Allies had trained for this moment since 1942. The scale of resources committed was sufficient. 3 airborne divisions were not symbolic forces. They represented tens of thousands of trained troops, supported by artillery delivered by glider, with scheduled resupply from the air. The ground column advancing from the south was powerful enough to exploit success quickly if delays were minimal. If airborne forces held even temporarily, armor would break through. The key assumption was time. The airborne troops did not need to defeat German forces decisively. They needed only to hold bridges long enough for relief to arrive. In operational calculations, this window was estimated at 48 hours. If the ground forces advanced on schedule, resistance would be overwhelmed piecemeal. From a purely military perspective, the opportunity was real because the German situation was unstable. Their reserves were limited. Their communications were disrupted. Their fuel shortages were severe. German commanders themselves later admitted that a rapid Allied thrust, properly timed, could have shattered their ability to defend the northern approaches to Germany. If the bridges were secured and the corridor held, the Allies would have crossed the Rhine without a set-piece assault. That alone would have altered the strategic balance. Beyond the Rhine lay the Ruhr, the industrial core of Germany. Its capture or isolation would have crippled German war production and forced a strategic collapse in the West. This was not fantasy. It was contingent logic. If the Germans failed to concentrate armor quickly, if weather remained clear, if airborne landings were accurate, if the ground column was not delayed, under those conditions, the operation could have succeeded. That was the opportunity Montgomery saw. Not certainty, but possibility. A narrow window created by enemy disarray and Allied superiority. It was a gamble, but not an irrational one when judged solely by abstract military mechanics. The danger lay not in the existence of the opportunity, but in its fragility. Every assumption had to hold. Every delay would multiply risk. The margin for error was minimal. Military logic allowed the operation only if intelligence was accurate and caution adjusted execution. That distinction would not survive the next phase. The warning did not come from instinct or dissent. It came from methodical preparation carried out before the first aircraft ever lifted off the runway. Major Brian Urquhart had spent weeks assembling a picture of the Dutch battle space that contradicted the assumptions underpinning Market Garden. His task was not to design operations or challenge commanders. It was to identify threats to airborne forces before they were committed. In that role, he worked systematically and without ambiguity. He began with aerial reconnaissance. RAF photographs taken at low altitude revealed armored vehicles concealed near Arnhem. Tanks were parked in wooded areas, dispersed but intact. Tracks in the soil indicated recent movement. These were not abandoned hulks or training dummies. They were operational vehicles with active support elements nearby. He cross-referenced those images with intercepted German communications. Ultra-decrypts confirmed the presence of SS Panzer formations refitting in the area. Unit identifiers matched known armored divisions withdrawn from Normandy for rest and reconstitution. The signal's traffic indicated command activity, logistics coordination, and movement orders. This was not the language of collapse. Dutch resistance reports reinforced the picture. Local observers described German convoys moving at night, fuel dumps being established, and troops billeted near Arnhem and Oosterbeek. These reports were consistent across multiple cells operating independently. They were not rumor or exaggeration. They aligned with the photographic and signals intelligence. Urquhart assembled these strands into a coherent assessment. The conclusion was direct. Two experienced SS Panzer divisions were positioned astride the final objective of the operation. They possessed armor, artillery, and veteran crews. They were exactly the type of force airborne troops were least equipped to face. He did not argue that the operation was impossible. He argued that its assumptions were flawed. Airborne units landing miles from the bridge would face organized armored resistance within hours, not days. Relief forces advancing along a single road would be delayed by terrain, traffic, and counterattacks. The 48-hour holding window was optimistic at best. Urquhart quantified the problem. He compared the light anti-tank weapons available to paratroopers against the armor known to be present. He calculated resupply rates under contested conditions. He assessed how quickly German units could concentrate once landings were detected. His conclusions were conservative, but grounded. He presented his findings first to Lieutenant General Browning. The response was dismissive. Browning regarded the intelligence as excessive caution. He believed the Germans lacked the capacity for coordinated response. The success of recent Allied advances had shaped expectations. Momentum had become evidence in itself. When the assessment reached Montgomery's headquarters, the reaction hardened. The operation was already politically committed. Eisenhower had been persuaded. Aircraft had been allocated. Supplies had been diverted. To acknowledge the intelligence now would require delay or revision, and both were unacceptable. The warnings were reframed as pessimism. Urquhart's age was noted. His lack of combat command experience was emphasized. At least one officer suggested he was under nervous strain. In the logic of military bureaucracy, this was decisive. Questioning mental fitness neutralized the warning without addressing its substance. Urquhart was ordered to take leave. His analysis remained on file, but it no longer had an advocate. The intelligence did not disappear. It was simply excluded from the decision-making process. What matters is not that the warning existed, but that it was complete. This was not a vague sense of danger. It was a detailed, evidence-based assessment delivered before the operation began. The risks were identified in advance, quantified, and explained in operational terms commanders understood. The preparation demonstrated that the system possessed the information required to adjust the plan. Landing zones could have been moved, timetables extended, objectives narrowed, armor priorities reconsidered. None of these options required brilliance, only acceptance of inconvenient facts. The warning established credibility through restraint. Urquhart did not dramatize. He did not appeal to fear. He presented evidence and consequences. The logic was simple. Airborne forces without heavy weapons cannot withstand armored formations indefinitely. Speed alone cannot compensate for geography and resistance. This was the central preparation phase of Market Garden, not the rehearsal of airborne units or the allocation of aircraft, but the assembly of knowledge that revealed the operation's vulnerability. The system functioned up to this point. Intelligence was gathered, analyzed, and reported accurately. What followed was not ignorance. It was choice. By the time the aircraft were fueled and the troops briefed, the warning had already been absorbed and rejected. The decision to proceed was made with full awareness of the risks, not in their absence. That distinction would define everything that followed. The overruling of the warning did not occur through argument. It occurred through structure. By the time the intelligence reached Montgomery, the operation had already crossed an invisible threshold. Market Garden was no longer a proposal. It had become a political commitment wrapped in military language. Reversing it would not simply alter a plan. It would disrupt relationships at the highest level of the Allied command. Montgomery had spent weeks pressing for a decisive, British-led operation. American armies were advancing rapidly across France, capturing cities, liberating territory, and dominating headlines. In Britain, the narrative was different. Public patience was thinning. The war was entering its sixth year. Churchill needed a dramatic stroke that placed British command at the center of victory in Northwest Europe. Market Garden promised exactly that. Churchill's support was not abstract. He backed Montgomery personally and publicly. He encouraged boldness and rewarded confidence. For Montgomery, this backing insulated his judgment from challenge. Any delay or revision could be interpreted not as prudence, but as weakness, and weakness had political consequences. Eisenhower's position was more constrained than his title suggested. As Supreme Allied Commander, his authority was real but conditional. He commanded a coalition, not a nation. His primary task was not to optimize individual operations, but to maintain cohesion between governments with different priorities, publics, and expectations. Montgomery understood this leverage. He framed Market Garden as an opportunity that could end the war early. If it succeeded, Eisenhower would share in the credit. If it failed, the failure could be attributed to uncertainty, weather, or execution. Refusing the plan outright would risk alienating Churchill and inflaming British opinion at a sensitive moment. The combined chiefs of staff system reinforced this dynamic. Major strategic decisions required consensus between British and American leadership. Eisenhower could not simply overrule Montgomery without triggering political escalation to London and Washington. Churchill had already made clear that Montgomery was not expendable. Within this environment, intelligence became a liability rather than an asset. Accepting Urquhart's assessment would require admitting that the plan rested on false assumptions. That admission would ripple outward. Aircraft allocations would be questioned. Supply priorities reconsidered. American airborne divisions, already placed under British command, would be reassigned. The political cost of delay would be immediate and visible. Institutional fear filled the gap where debate should have existed. Staff officers understood the risks of challenging Montgomery directly. Careers had been damaged for less. Questioning the plan was framed as lack of confidence. Raising objections suggested disloyalty at a moment when unity was publicly emphasized as decisive. The mechanism was subtle but effective. Intelligence officers were marginalized. Warnings were reclassified as pessimism. The language shifted from assessment to attitude. Once the warning was labeled a mindset problem rather than an operational problem, it no longer required refutation. Montgomery himself did not need to suppress dissent aggressively. His reputation did the work. He was known for methodical planning and prior success. El Alamein still defined his image. The belief that he would not gamble recklessly became self-reinforcing, even as the plan itself grew increasingly dependent on perfect conditions. Eisenhower's approval completed the process. It was not an endorsement of the intelligence assessment, nor a validation of the operational logic. It was a political calculation. Approving Market Garden preserved alliance harmony. Rejecting it risked open conflict with Churchill and the British High Command. This was the point at which military logic became subordinate, not because it was unknown, but because acknowledging it carried unacceptable institutional consequences. The system prioritized cohesion over correction. Once approval was granted, reversal became impossible. Aircraft schedules were locked. Units were briefed. Public expectations were shaped. Any subsequent adjustment would be interpreted as hesitation, and hesitation was seen as more dangerous than risk. The overruling of the warning was therefore not a single act. It was a process driven by alliance politics, command ego, public narrative, and bureaucratic self-preservation. Each layer reinforced the next until dissent had no pathway upward. By the time the operation launched, the decision to ignore intelligence was no longer visible as a decision. It had become embedded in momentum. The system moved forward because stopping would have required confronting forces that no military briefing could resolve. The battlefield would soon expose the cost of that choice. The consequences unfolded exactly where the warning said they would, and for exactly the reasons that had been identified in advance. On the afternoon of September 17th, the Airborne Armada crossed the Dutch coast and released its formations. At the southern end of the corridor, landings near Eindhoven proceeded largely as planned. Bridges were taken. Resistance was scattered. Further north, American airborne units around Nijmegen encountered stronger opposition, but momentum was preserved through force and persistence. At Arnhem, the pattern broke immediately. The British 1st Airborne Division landed farther from its objective than planned, constrained by terrain, air defense concerns, and aircraft limitations. The distance mattered. It consumed time. It fragmented formations. It allowed German units already present to react before the bridge could be secured. Within hours, German armor was moving. Not in confusion, not in retreat, but deliberately. Elements of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions were already refitting in the area. Crews were experienced. Commanders were competent. They recognized the significance of the bridge instantly and concentrated against it. The airborne troops were not equipped for this fight. Their anti-tank weapons were limited. Heavy artillery had not arrived. Resupply depended on airdrops that were increasingly inaccurate and contested. Communications were unreliable. Units that were supposed to converge instead fought in isolation. The ground column advancing from the south encountered its own constraints. The single road that defined the operation became a choke point. Traffic jams formed. Vehicles were forced into predictable movement. German counterattacks did not need to stop the advance completely. They only needed to delay it. Every delay compounded the airborne crisis. Hours became days. The 48-hour assumption collapsed quietly and irreversibly. At Arnhem, the bridge could not be held. The small force that reached it fought with discipline and determination. But determination was not a substitute for armor or reinforcement. German tanks isolated positions methodically. Buildings were reduced one by one. Ammunition dwindled. Casualties mounted. Attempts at resupply failed. Drop zones fell under German control. Supplies intended for British paratroopers were captured by the enemy. Wounded men could not be evacuated. Medical facilities were overwhelmed and then destroyed. The wider operation continued, but without coherence. Nijmegen was eventually secured, but too late to affect Arnhem. The corridor existed, but it was fragile, constantly threatened, and incapable of delivering decisive relief in time. By the 9th day, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Of the roughly 10,000 men who had landed near Arnhem, fewer than a quarter would escape across the river. The rest were killed or captured. The British 1st Airborne Division ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The casualty figures accumulated with bureaucratic precision. Over 17,000 Allied casualties across the operation. American airborne units suffered heavily. Polish forces were committed late and achieved little except losses. Equipment was destroyed or abandoned. Aircraft were lost. Trained airborne manpower, which took years to produce, was expended in days. The strategic outcome was nothing. The Rhine remained uncrossed. The route into Germany was not opened. The Ruhr was untouched. The German defensive line, battered but intact, stabilized. The consequences did not end with numbers. Morale within airborne formations was deeply affected. Survivors understood that they had been placed into an unwinnable situation. They did not attribute their losses to chance or bad weather. They recognized the structural failure of the plan. Trust in higher command eroded quietly but permanently. Within Allied command, resentment hardened. American generals questioned why their airborne divisions had been subordinated to a plan they had privately opposed. Supplies diverted to Market Garden had been unavailable elsewhere, slowing advances that faced less resistance and offered greater returns. Montgomery's response followed a familiar pattern. Responsibility was dispersed. Weather was blamed for delayed drops and failed resupply. Intelligence was criticized for underestimating German strength, despite having warned of it explicitly. American ground forces were faulted for not advancing fast enough. Even the Dutch resistance was cited for allegedly inaccurate reporting. What Montgomery did not acknowledge was the central fact that the plan had required everything to go right and nothing to go wrong. Once that condition failed, collapse was inevitable. Eisenhower absorbed the failure without public confrontation. To do otherwise would have risked the alliance. There was no formal censure, no command relief, no admission of error at the top. Market Garden was classified as a bold attempt that did not succeed, but its effects were structural. The destruction of the British Airborne Division reduced Allied flexibility for the remainder of the campaign. Large-scale airborne operations were no longer credible options. The loss of momentum extended the war in the West by months. German forces were granted time to regroup, reinforce, and prepare new defensive positions. The failure also shaped future decisions indirectly. Caution increased, but selectively. Risk would be accepted again, but often in less imaginative ways, through attritional assaults rather than operational maneuver. German commanders drew their own conclusions. They had not defeated the Allies through brilliance or numbers. They had survived because Allied decision-making had constrained itself. The pause created by Market Garden allowed German units to reconstitute, transfer reserves, and prepare for the battles that followed. Every consequence traced backward along a single line. The airborne troops were isolated because relief was delayed. Relief was delayed because the corridor was narrow. The corridor was narrow because the plan concentrated everything along one axis. The plan concentrated everything along one axis because speed was prioritized over resilience. Speed was prioritized because political pressure demanded decisive results. Political pressure overrode intelligence. There were no surprises in this sequence. Each link had been visible before the operation began. The battlefield did not reveal new information. It merely enforced existing realities. The cost was paid by the men on the ground, not by the men in the command rooms. Losses were recorded. Units were withdrawn. Reports were written. The campaign continued. Market Garden passed into official history as an ambitious failure. But ambition was not the decisive variable. The decisive factor was that a known risk was accepted not for military necessity, but for political and institutional convenience. The consequences were final by the time the last survivors crossed the river at Arnhem. Nothing that followed could undo them. In the years after the war, the record closed slowly, through paperwork rather than ceremony. Initial after-action reports were cautious. Language was restrained. Market Garden was described as an operation that had not achieved its objectives due to a combination of factors. Weather was mentioned. Communications were mentioned. Enemy resistance was noted as stronger than anticipated. Responsibility was diffused across circumstances rather than assigned to decisions. As documents were declassified and memoirs published, the picture sharpened. Intelligence summaries confirmed that German armored formations had been present at Arnhem in exactly the strength reported before the operation. Reconnaissance photographs, once dismissed, were re-examined and validated. Intercepted communications matched post-war German unit records. There was no intelligence failure in the narrow sense. The information had been accurate. German accounts reinforced this conclusion. Officers from the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions described how they had reacted quickly to the landings, concentrating forces against the bridge once its significance became clear. They had not anticipated the operation in detail, but they were well positioned to exploit it once it began. The opportunity presented itself, and they took it. Allied casualty reports finalized in late 1944 and early 1945 quantified the cost. Over 17,000 casualties across all participating forces. The British 1st Airborne Division effectively destroyed. Its survivors reassigned, its identity dissolved. The loss was permanent. There was no rapid reconstitution. Internal correspondence revealed what public statements avoided. Eisenhower acknowledged privately that the risks had been extreme. He noted concerns about the narrow corridor and the dependency on perfect timing. He also acknowledged the political pressures surrounding the operation. These admissions did not translate into public accountability. Churchill's role became clearer with time. His encouragement of bold action was consistent with his wartime leadership style. He valued dramatic initiative and symbolic victories. Market Garden aligned with that instinct. There is no evidence that he pushed for detailed reconsideration once the plan was framed as decisive and British-led. Montgomery's own post-war writings did not revisit the intelligence warning in substance. He maintained that the plan had been sound and that execution failures had undermined it. He argued that Arnhem had been held longer than expected and that the operation had been 90% successful. This formulation entered popular memory, not because it was accurate, but because it was repeated without institutional challenge. Other commanders were more direct and private. American officers questioned the diversion of resources and the subordination of airborne forces to a plan they had opposed. These critiques remained largely unpublished at the time, out of deference to alliance unity and post-war reconciliation. What the post-war record makes unavoidable is the sequence. The intelligence existed. It was credible. It was delivered through proper channels. It was overridden not by superior analysis, but by considerations external to military logic. Subsequent operational planning reflected this implicitly. Large-scale airborne operations were avoided. River crossings reverted to methodical, heavily supported assaults. Speed was sacrificed for redundancy. The war continued, and it ended, without another attempt at such concentrated audacity in the West. Market Garden was not erased from doctrine, but it was isolated. It became an example discussed quietly rather than a model to be repeated. The silence around it was itself a form of judgment. The men who had warned of the risks did not receive formal vindication. Careers moved on. Files were closed. The system absorbed the failure without acknowledging its cause. By the time historians had access to the full documentary record, the conclusions required little interpretation. The outcome aligned precisely with the warnings that had been dismissed. There were no hidden variables, no unforeseeable shocks. The post-war record did not reveal new mistakes. It confirmed old ones. Market Garden stands in the archive as a case where knowledge was present, authority was misapplied, and consequence followed predictably. Nothing in the later documentation contradicts that sequence. It only completes it. The verdict is settled by the record. Operation Market Garden failed because it was executed in defiance of information that accurately described the battlefield before the first aircraft took off. The decision to proceed was not made under uncertainty. It was made with knowledge that the core assumptions were unsound. German forces were not broken beyond response. Airborne troops could not hold isolated objectives against armor. A single corridor could not sustain uninterrupted advance. These facts were established in advance and disregarded. The choice to proceed was shaped by forces outside military logic. British political prestige demanded a decisive, British-led operation. Alliance management constrained the authority of the supreme commander. Institutional culture punished dissent more effectively than error. Momentum replaced analysis. The battlefield did not introduce chaos. It enforced reality. German armor concentrated where predicted. Relief was delayed exactly as warned. Airborne forces were isolated, reduced, and destroyed. The outcome followed the plan's internal weaknesses with mechanical precision. No subsequent explanation alters that sequence. Weather did not create the vulnerability. Execution did not invent the risk. Intelligence did not fail. The system failed by overriding its own evidence. The cost was paid in casualties that served no strategic purpose. The British 1st Airborne Division was eliminated. Allied momentum was blunted. The war in the West was prolonged. German resistance survived long enough to fight again. Post-war documentation confirms every warning and contradicts every justification offered afterward. The decision stands as a closed case of authority prevailing over analysis and politics prevailing over prudence. Market Garden was not lost on the battlefield. It was lost in the command room, at the moment when audacity was chosen over correction. That choice was irreversible. If you want to continue examining decisions like this, subscribe to the channel. If you have reached a different conclusion, leave a comment. The record is open.